morning, everyone. My name's Andrea Maxey. I'm Vice President Corporate Affairs, Community and HR with AngloGold Ashanti, and I'm also a Director of the Gold Industry Group. It's my pleasure to welcome you to our 6th Diggers and Dealers Leadership Breakfast with Deloitte. I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which we're gathered, the Wongatha people, and pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging. In this morning's Power Hour, I'm looking forward to joining Sally and Michael on the panel to share my insights and practical tips on how we can build resilient leaders and cultures and prepare our workforce and organisations for current challenges and the changes that are coming. But before we commence our panel session, I'd like to share the highlights from a recent initiative here in Kalgoorlie that we're particularly proud of, made possible by the Gold Industry Group earlier this year.
I'm really grateful that the Gold Industry Group do get us out here. They don't have to, but we're so lucky that they do, and we get to work with these beautiful people. So yeah, I mean, what a job. I'm very lucky.
WA is an incredibly large state, and for us to be able to have that partnership with the gold industry, which means that we can get out there in the community, into the regions and visit more of the state and not just stay in and around Perth, is really rewarding for both us and hopefully for the girls as well.
I think for us, like, the early mornings are so worth it. When they're here, they're calling your name, they're so invested. I think for me, just seeing their big smiles, I just love it so much.
Yeah, I think it's really important that the regional girls get to just sit down and have a chat with us. We often don't get out to regional communities, and yeah, just the opportunity to share our stories and I guess inspire them to follow that Netball WA pathway. I think that's a really important thing here. Well, I think some of the girls actually have better skills than I do, so we might see a fever player out there.
It's been really interesting today. There have been so many synergies between both netball and the gold mining industry. We had time to sit down and to speak with some of the key workers around projects that they've been working on. I think the crux of teamwork and excellent leadership falls across all really good work environments.
I think our relationship with GIG is super important. They're a big influence for us, and I think anything that we can give back to them is instrumental. It was actually nice to see what their specialty is, and hearing so much knowledge. I guess for me, I didn't really know what was going on with mining, so it was nice just to know about gold and that it's got its own DNA, like all different things like that. My mind was just exploding.
I think that's why we love working with GIG so much, that we get the opportunity to come out to these incredible places and get to hang out with some really incredible kids and just share our knowledge, but yeah, just get out into the community.
Our strategic partnerships provide the opportunity to magnify our reach and engagement with the community. And our long-term partnership with Netball WA, West Coast Fever and Shooting Stars has achieved just that. Now in our 6th year of operation, our role in championing Australia's gold industry continues to grow as we connect with Australians across the country through our long-term initiatives. Our programs, partnerships, communications and events are influencing perceptions and educating thousands, creating a supportive, informed community. I encourage you all to get involved in our newest nationwide programs, our popular National Gold Education Program and Gold Jobs Initiative, both of which are centred around education and developing talent pathways to support our future industry workforce, which I'm sure we can all agree are critical areas for the industry to focus on. Another area of focus is mental health. And today I'm proud to officially launch our 3rd tour with mental health charity partner Livin. This powerful program connects with its audience by sharing lived experience and has been embraced by our workforces, changing the lives of many.
We're pretty hopeless at getting help for physical conditions, let alone mental conditions. They're breaking down the barriers and letting them know that they can seek help without the fear of ridicule or embarrassment is pretty much what we're trying to achieve. My name's Corey, I'm 35 years old, I'm working in the mining industry for about 13 years and 9 years at the current site I'm at right now. I work underground on a drill. Living is a program created by two young guys from the Gold Coast. They tragically lost a mate to a mental illness. Their motto is, "It ain't weak to speak," and that pretty much boils down to speak up and get help. There's no shame in it. There's no need for embarrassment. The Living Workshop pretty much gave me the tools and the ideals to speak up if I had any demons, and to listen to anyone if they ever came to me. The partnership between the gold industry group and Living is incredibly important in my opinion. There's a lot of unique challenges in the mining industry. You go down underground and you see a Living sticker inside a machine and you look at it and it just reminds you to speak up, reminds you that there's no shame in it. And it's cool to seeing people underground embrace that, and on various mine sites, I'm sure.
This month, we're embarking on a national tour to bring more than 80 of Living's empowering mental health workshops to schools in the regions our members operate in across Australia. The strength of the Gold Industry Group is in leading initiatives that harness the industry collective to magnify our impact in the community. And I thank our members for championing our vision to connect Australians to our gold industry. I'd now like to invite Deloitte partner Nikki Ivory to the stage. Thank you.
Thank you, Andrea. Good morning, everyone, and welcome on behalf of Deloitte. For those of you I don't know, my name is Nikki Ivory. I'm a partner with Deloitte in Perth, and I've worked with mining companies for the best part of 2 decades now. So last year we talked about transitioning to a low-carbon mining environment and the drivers of decarbonisation. We talked about climate risk, investor demands, and we talked about supply chain demands. So today we have launched a report, Building Climate Capability for a Resilient Mining Sector. So it continues that theme, and those reports are available for download or at the back of the room if you're interested. However, when we looked at what we wanted to talk about today, we looked at the past 12 months, we decided to focus on more generally how we build resilient leaders and cultures and how we can prepare our workforce and our organisations for future disruptions. Australia's mining industries responded really well to the events of 2020. I mean, there was great strength, enormous adaptability and resilience shown in the response to COVID. But the disruptions don't end there. It's not the end of the road because we've done well through COVID. And we continue as an industry to face into big and uncertain issues. So I'm going to kick off, Sally, by asking you to look at ESG and climate in particular. You sit on a number of boards across the industry. Is this a concern across the board, and how are boards thinking about this issue?
Big question to start with. Look, all of the boards I'm on, it is a huge topic and we're spending a significant amount of time on it. And I think the challenge comes in trying to think about it in a way that's meaningful. You can deliver some results around it. It's measurable and it's actually not knee-jerk. I think that doing it in a responsible and managed way is quite important. Some of the things I've been pleasantly surprised about, it's not just in the companies I'm involved with, it's not just the boards driving it either, it is management driving it. And even our culture surveys throughout the organisation have shown how ESG is important to the entire workforce, not just the board, not just management. So that's quite reassuring. I think it's certainly gaining traction. I think that it's complex, and a director I work with, when we're discussing it, tries to bring it back to a very simple way of thinking about it, and he always says, what's the right thing to do? I think we trip ourselves up when we're trying to really overthink this, and so I try and put the backdrop of what he says all the time. Well, what are we trying to achieve? Why do we want to achieve it? And make it simple. So that would be my view on ESG and climate. But yes, as the boards I'm on, it is, if not number one topic at every board meeting, most meetings.
Excellent, thank you. Michael, in this report that we've launched today, we use this term climate resilience, and we've heard this term a lot more in the last 12 months than before that. So could you please explain to us what climate resilient means in layman's terms and why it's important for the mining sector?
Layman's terms, I'll try. It is a really complicated just definition to go through, but I'll do my best. But what we'll start off with in terms of the response, I'll go back and reflect on early concerns around the pandemic and whether that would actually derail efforts or momentum to decarbonise. And so questions around will the pandemic deflect efforts in the short term were raised, and more particularly, will there be doubling down to align with the Paris Agreement? And I think looking back in the last sort of 12 to 18 months, I think we can all say that there's been nothing short of staggering in terms of the response from economies and business. So following, just to give you some examples, it's like the matrix in my head. I've got ones and zeros flowing with all these numbers and digits, so I need to refer to some of the notes that have just come out. So following the Climate Leaders Summit in 2021, a series of commitments were made, and so from a GDP perspective, global, 50% of the world's GDP is covered by a net zero target. So have a ponder about that. And then 70% of the world's economy now is covered by a net zero target. So that is crazy, the coverage. And just to give you an idea about how much of a lag Australia is, which is a big competitive issue for the mining sector and us in WA, the US has set a new target, so they're 50 to 52%, and that's up from around 26 to 28%, which is Australia's current target. But what they've been really clever around is forging those relationships with India, Japan, China for trade reasons. If you fast forward to other trade partners around the EU, one of the really interesting things that they're looking at is a border adjustment tariff. So if we export product into that region, we don't have a carbon price, we'll get penalised for that. So this is hitting our bottom lines now, and will start to pretty soon. One of the areas of concern for us is China, of course. They've got localised emissions trading schemes, around 7 or 9 province-based ones. They will have a national emissions trading scheme later this year, and almost certainly they will have a border adjustment tariff. So that's interesting in itself. And I just think, just tying this back once again into what it means for the mining sector, the market cap of the top 20 is around $1 trillion. That's my calculation, so it's probably off by 50 plus or minus 50%, but you get the direction. More than 70% of that, and I'd say probably 80 to 90% of that, is covered by some form of net zero target, and that's staggering in itself. So there's a clear trend. The top miners are doing it. It's hitting the mid caps, and I think if we reflect back on late last decade, that wouldn't have been the case. I realise I haven't answered your question around resilience, so. Thank you. So climate resilience is essentially 2 parts of the story. We're really focused on mitigation, which is reducing greenhouse gas emissions. But personally, the bigger issue is the physical side. So how the physical climate will change, impact our operating assets, impact our enabling infrastructure, and impact our routes to our customers, but more importantly, our customers of customers. So the physical side, and it's going to be important for investors. They're going to be wanting to know how climate resilient you are. So in short, transition, decarb, yep, tick, but the physical side is more important and will be more important.
Okay, thank you. Andrea, ESG climate is probably not something you had many questions about from investors when you worked in investor relations just a few years ago, yet now it seems to be the first thing investors ask about. What are the key aspects that investors want to see addressed, and how can miners practically respond?
Well, it's certainly front of mind for investors now. Meetings that we go to with our company, equity investors as well as bondholders, it's the first thing they ask about. And they're not just asking about sort of metrics and wanting to tick boxes. They want to actually know how you're approaching ESG, what you're practically doing in your operations, to the extent that sovereign wealth funds in particular like to visit operations to have a really good look at what you're doing in the community, what you're doing in relation to environment in particular. So it's quite a challenging environment for companies to work in. I think, as Sally said before, it's also something that employees very conscious of, and it's something that attracts employers to a company if they feel that that company is really committed to its ESG objectives. So from a company perspective, I think you certainly need expertise on the board, and you need to bring expertise in to help you. And I think a very important thing is also to make sure that you understand the perspectives of all of your stakeholders, not just investors, but also your employees and the local communities.
Thank you. So on that theme of pressure mounting from investors in particular, Michael, can you perhaps talk to us about how companies can take practical steps to take meaningful action? So what are some of the things they can do to make it, on climate in particular I'm talking about, but ESG more generally as well, quantifiable and measurable steps that are simple for all stakeholders to understand?
Yeah, sure. From a I'm going to go back to a bit of default, because decarb's a topic that most people can understand and appreciate. And the actual equation is pretty simple. There needs to be a decoupling between emissions and growth in production. So that sounds pretty easy, but in reality that's quite difficult. And so from a practical side, when we think around decarb, there's really three main horizons. Immediately, and I'm talking about most simplified metals and mining businesses, it's around power systems. Why power systems to start with is the levelised cost of energy and the technology readiness is favourable. The next step and the bigger challenge is diesel. How do we deal with diesel? How do we displace it firstly? How do we eventually substitute it with other forms like hydrogen and electrification? And then how do we just eliminate it completely? And then the residual is the hard to abate sectors. And from our side, this pressure is only going to intensify as investors and capital markets continue to ask more questions. And probably more important for us is that our off-takers are asking questions, but more importantly, our customers are asking. So the actual end users of the product are saying, hey, we want to know the traceability of this product. So practically, how do we start? It's all around data. It's a very boring starting point, but if you don't have good data, these are going to be major capital investment decisions that you are making as businesses, and one of the fundamental inputs is data. And from an emission side, it's around greenhouse gases. So looking at your direct emissions, which is occurring within the facility, looking at your scope 2, which is from electricity from the grid, but as importantly, your scope 3, which is all your value chain. So you've got to have visibility of that. And getting down to the equipment level is a really, really important thing. So for ESG and for decarb more broadly, where we're going to end up is that our customers we want to have a traceable product. So they all want to see the embodied emissions and ESG factors being provided through that whole value chain and trace that. That's the ultimate destination. So how do we chemically trace our products? How do we physically trace our products? And how do we use technology to trace that through the supply chain? That can't start tomorrow, that's got to start today. From a reducing emissions side, I mentioned that there is that focus on power systems, diesel, and then hard to abate. But the market's moved on from targets. There's a rush of the arms race to get to net zero commitments by present day, and which is not aligned to science in most cases. But the market's matured, and they want to see capital being spent and projects being delivered. So for those who have set targets, and for those who haven't, the expectation has shifted already in 12 months that they want to see projects actually implemented, so you'll get more pressure. And don't forget about the physical side as well. And lastly, the most important thing is around the narrative, but just making sure you've got a strong internal narrative as to the why, and making sure you're actually telling that story to your external community as well. So that narrative is going to help with employee value propositions around the direction of the business and just telling that story to your investors.
Thank you. So I didn't hear anything there about how we put KPIs on leaders to make sure that they do this. So is there a way we can link practically remuneration to ESG outcomes? Anyone want to take that one?
Give it to you, Michael.
There's lots of nervousness in the audience.
Look, I think from a short-term perspective, it's around intensity-based metrics. So clearly, whether that's ESG-related or emissions intensity-based, it is clearly the way to go. And you've just got to make it real for the assets. That's the biggest disconnection at the moment, is that it's group expectations, but what does it actually mean for the sites? and the asset owners there's a disconnect. And when we look forward once again from an emissions perspective, and I'm going to use it as the default example once again, is that we've got to see those long-term commitments. And when I refer back to those emissions intensities, what we want to see is metrics like tonnes per BCM, TTM, per ROM, per saleable product being implemented through your life of asset plans and through your short-term mine planning processes. So they're the things you want to see. I was going to steer this a little bit down the carbon pricing route as well. That could be an interesting way to more of a behavioural change, and you can do that through setting a price at the portfolio level, which is meant to impact your investment decisions and thinking about your portfolio. You can have investment funds essentially to penalise your dirty emitters within your portfolio and fund emissions projects. And the other way you can actually do it is through an internal emissions trading scheme.
Okay. I might just add on that. I think the challenge with any STI or LTI program is making targets that the external market sees are aggressive enough, and particularly around ESG, but making them achievable for the management team. Because if you set these lofty expectations and management know that there's no way they're going to get there, it's so disincentivising to the group. So I think that's really tricky, but I think investors are going to want to see some pretty hard, pretty stretched targets around ESG measures.
Sally, I think one of the questions that we get a lot is that we set these targets, but what's it going to cost? There's always with these longer term issues, there's that uncertainty that when you look forward that we just don't know around technology and so forth. And have you seen STIs and LTIs around it?
Yeah, absolutely. And look, in setting REM targets with a couple of my businesses at the moment, absolutely all that piece is being considered, because I think you can set phenomenal targets around ESG, but there is a cost, and that just has to go hand in hand. So it's not a straightforward exercise. It's complicated.
I think we might leave that one there. Probably needs a whole session of its own at some point. Sally, let's change tack a little bit and talk a bit about the workforce. So we have heard a lot in the last 12 months about mental health issues, sexual assault issues. I could carry on listing them. As a board, you obviously rely to a large extent on management to set the culture that leads to keeping your people healthy, safe and well. So what does good leadership on this front look like to you as a board member?
Yeah, and I'm very fortunate. I work with some phenomenal leaders that I actually learn from every day. I was thinking about this last night. There's probably 3 key traits that gives me confidence that the leader is setting the right example to the rest of the organisation. I think the first thing is actually having a clear strategy, so everyone knows why they're there and what they're doing. The second trait I see a lot of is courage, and when I say courage, it's the ability to have a tough conversation. If it's someone who's underperforming, if it's around ESG, whatever it is, they don't shy away from the trickier issues. And the final attribute I see in really good leaders is probably curiosity, and I'll use someone who's in the room as an example. When I walk around sites with Raoul Finlayson, he never stops asking questions, and he has this lovely natural curiosity. He's not trying to find out what's going on, with safety or whatever. He's actually genuinely interested in what everyone at that site is doing, and I think that's a really strong leadership trait that I think works really well. Broader though, if I get away from traits, I think the other things I've seen in really strong leaders is the ability to bring different views into a conversation. So perhaps the quietest person in a meeting may have the best idea, but it takes a really clever person to sort of bring that person in. And I think finally I'd say one other thing, and it's embrace diversity. And when I talk about diversity, it's not around gender, it's around age, bringing people in from different industries, different cultures, different abilities into your team, because I think that's really what makes teams work incredibly well.
Thank you. Andrea, continuing the theme of keeping people safe, obviously this has been a big priority for miners for many years. Safety's been the number one issue probably for the past 2 decades at least. And we've known for a while that FIFO brings a different kind of safety challenge, namely mental health of workers and their families. And then COVID came along, and that's thrown up another set of challenges for people. And then more recently, we've seen in the headlines the sexual harassment cases. So what can mining companies do practically to make sure that they're keeping people physically and mentally healthy and safe in all respects?
Well, certainly a spotlight on the industry at the moment. The public's really looking at what we're doing, but our workforce has been through a very challenging time. We're fortunate in WA, of course, that we haven't suffered a lot of the lockdowns that some other places have, but we've had to keep people on site for longer periods, longer rosters, and they've all handled it very well. I think Sally touched on it before when she said about the importance of leadership. We need leadership on these issues as well. And I think a second point is to really focus on the culture of your organisation. It has to be an inclusive culture in order to move forward into being a mentally and healthy workplace. I know that we and a lot of other companies have put a lot of thought into the way we approach this, and it's a complex issue that needs to be addressed in multiple ways, but just for starters, it's education, removing stigma, training, making support services available that might not have been available before, beyond just having an EAP service available. And the physical part of it is important as well for mental wellbeing. I think on our mine sites, it's a community, so we need to create the social support that people need in a normal community as well. It's a big challenge, and of course workforces in office environments working on their own, that's a big challenge.
So skills, still talking about workforce. Michael, climate action requires a whole new set of skills for mining companies to bring into them. Some of the projects, even understanding the data you were talking about, there's a whole raft of skills that are going to be needed. So these are not things we typically see in mining companies or associated with the mining sector. So how do miners go about building this expertise? Particularly, I'm interested in the mid-tier miners who don't just have a big checkbook to bring out to buy these skills in like the big mining houses do.
Yeah, I think everyone's grappling with the same issues. From my perspective anyway, I think a lot of the skills do exist within organisations. They just need to be reframed. And so a lot of the immediate challenges around emissions and risk management can be done in-house. And then the more complex issues you can start to outsource. In particular for the mid-cap and the small tier miners, it's all around collaboration and sharing it. It just has to be. There's an old adage of, if you want to go fast, go alone. But if you want to go far, go together. And I think that's a really, really cool statement for this challenge, the wicked challenge of ESG and decarb. But if I was a CEO, the sort of minimum requirements I would want to see is that you've got a strategy and portfolio management capability that really understands the financial sector and how that will change the pathway for us as a business. I'd have a mine planning process that adjusts and considers ESG into the principles of our life of asset planning processes at a minimum. I would have a procurement function that understands all the choices that we're making and the pathways that we're locking ourselves into. And I want operations to have plans, really clear plans for the life of the assets around how we decarbonise, how we think about water security, water stress issues and broader ESG matters.
Okay. I'm going to change tack again and ask one more question before I open it to the audience. Sally, another big issue for mining companies is the growing risk of cyber attacks. So we again see a lot of this in the press. What are you seeing at a board level though, and what is in practice the best response that mining companies should be taking to respond to this threat?
Thank you. It's ironic that I'm answering this question because my 11-year-old does all of my technical things at home, include sometimes turning on my iPad.
I think we're all in that boat.
So firstly, I think you need to understand the risk, and that involves what are your company's assets. And I think where we are aware there is operational issues with our mining assets and being hacked and that stopping production, but we haven't seen a lot of that in Australia yet. But I think that it is a potential and we need to be aware of it. I think we need to understand what the kinds of attacks are, whether they're phishing emails, whether they're ransoms, whether it's, as I said, operational hacks. And I think it's really important that your systems are regularly audited by an external provider. I think the service providers, Big Four out there, are getting very good at articulating where our weaknesses are. So as a board, understanding those are in place and getting regular reports on it. Ongoing training. So we have, in a couple of the boards I'm on, we have, it's twice yearly we will have an email come out, and it's a little training course and then a pop quiz at the end about what is the right and wrong thing to do. Interestingly enough, I think non-exec directors are probably the worst at clicking on phishing links and exposing the system. So I think, the ongoing training is quite important. The other thing I think would be important, and we're seeing a lot of it happen in the US, is these ransom situations where data is hacked. And I think that, I would be encouraging most boards to have a pre-mortem or a 5-minute or 10-minute chat, even what are our systems around this, what would we do if this happened, what would our response be? Because I think you'll be judged as much for your response as being the target of a ransom attack. I think it's really important to understand your reporting obligations for breaches. They are, they're quite stringent and they are being updated regularly. And I also think, as a director, understanding what sort of insurance you have in place for cyber attacks. Now, that insurance is incredibly expensive and it's actually quite hard to get, but it's important to know it's there and if it's applicable to your business. Company. So that would be my view from an almost technically illiterate director.
Okay, I'm going to open it now to the audience. Hopefully you've all banked up some nice questions to ask our panel. Would anyone like to kick off? Don't see a flood of hands. Stu, excellent. There's the mic.
Look, probably maybe for Michael. Question around, obviously, Scope 1, 2 emissions reduction or displacement with renewables, wind, solar, etc. When's the conversation going to start regarding nuclear power generation? Fukushima was 10 years ago. Absolutely need to understand the cleanest, simplest energy generation in nuclear and how ready is Australia to start talking about that?
Yeah, sure. I like the question. Look, there's obviously perception issues around nuclear. Is an unbelievable energy source. Issues is obviously the downstream and upstream use of of uranium. You can see where my head's at. But cost is a big issue and the demand. Technology is advancing. The small-scale nuclear reactors are pretty good, but I think we've got a long way. And to be honest, there's other fuel types like hydrogen, like electrification through solar, wind, and the storage components are coming down from a learning rates perspective. So I think given the challenges of hydrogen, nuclear, and hydrogen, and electrification and batteries, I don't think we'll see it in Australia, to be honest.
It's a bit of a political issue, isn't it? Does anyone else have a view on it on our panel? Hot potato. Yeah. Okay. Any other questions?
Hi, I'm Pips from Automate. Obviously now in the industry there's a bit of a move towards automation, which is obviously our area. Probably a question for Andrea. There's a lot of, I suppose that you could call it fear in the industry for operators and drivers, and they think, oh my word, where's my job going with automation coming in? How would you as a leader deal with that kind of question or that kind of fear?
Oh, it's a very good question, and it sort of links back to the challenges that we're having with talent at the moment too, in a way, because we're in a moment in time where we're going to be transitioning into a very different way of work, I think, and we need to in order to retain talent. So that gets you into the area of upskilling and, in fact, bringing new people into our industry in mining. And it's really because of this small pool of talent that we have at the moment, we're all poaching from each other, and we're really at a point where we need to start building more capability rather than buying it or poaching it off others. And you'll see, I'm sure many of you are aware of what Curtin University is doing here in WA with micro-credentials. The government, both federal and state, are working very hard with industry to look at ways that we can better utilise the education sector to support industry. And I think it's very important for all of us to collaborate on some of that work rather than focusing on our own areas. And alongside automation, there's also data science. That's going to be a really big area of growth and where we're going to need expertise going forward.
Sally, anything to add from your perspective? Yeah, I think the organisations that will thrive over the next 5 to 10 years will adopt automation, but they will also understand there's an asset of employees there that can be re-skilled. And I think if the earlier they get on that journey, the better. And I think that's the only way to look at it, because we are all skills short at the moment. We're all having higher turnover rates than what we anticipated. Salaries are increasing. So if we don't get clever about resourcing those people into other avenues, it's just going to be more pain.
Thank you. Any other questions?
Good morning. I'm Roger Staley from Mining Plus. Thank you very much for the insights. And Michael, I'm seizing on the point you made about the importance of reporting or ESG data. Are you or any other members of the panel aware of really good examples where mining companies are not just taking the reporting, but they're taking that as input into simulation and scheduling of their current and future operations?
Yeah, certainly. There is that technology out there, and with sensors and so forth, there is that dovetailing into your mine planning processes that we are seeing. They're still probably more in the reactive state rather than the predictive state, and we'll probably start seeing things like digital twins being created fairly soon. I can't give you specific examples, but there are definitely more better in class performers who are doing that. It's incredibly difficult, obviously, to do, but the life of asset planning and overlaying carbon and other ESG factors is a good starting point.
Natalia Stiltsova, Remilis. It's a question to Andrea as chair of the gold mining group, and also Sally as a director of Perth Mint. And the question is about Scope 3 emissions. What's happening in this area between the gold mining companies and Perth Mint, and has it been discussed as part of the gold group?
Absolutely, it's been discussed, and I think it's something we are working on in terms of just giving you live hard targets here and now. It's not really my place to do that, but certainly at Goldcorp we hired a chief sustainability officer earlier this year, and that is that individual's mandate to deliver hard targets. And she's up at Diggers and will be wandering around. So I'm happy to introduce you. I think she's at the back of the room.
Not
Sorry,
to put
Steph.
her on the spot.
I'll defer to Steph.
Guy Boggs from the CRC for Transformation in Mining Economies. So my question this morning, in the ESG and climate adaptive space, there is and in the conversation this morning, there's been a lot of talk about asset life, in the way in which we look at ESG and climate adaptive or carbon accounting methods. How do you define that in relation to the life beyond the mine? So a lot of the decisions in the ESG and climate space actually have an extended life beyond what we would consider asset life. Has that started to come into the footprint type analysis that you're seeing?
No, it's mostly just annualised. The requirements for legislative slides are just annual, and for more of the voluntary side is around disclosing emissions targets. So there's no regulatory or market-based requirement that say you need to forecast what your emissions will be beyond the reported life of the asset.
Anyone can answer. from an Australian industry perspective, as we take action to decarbonise and source products and shift it, how do we make sure that it's not just shifting offshore, that we're not just pushing down the supply chain, that we're actually buying materials that are then sourced from a climate perspective? We're considering that we don't just push it out of Australia and it's just down the supply chain further.
I can take that one. The companies I'm involved with, I'll speak for, we are very, very strong on auditing our entire supply chain as to where goods and services come from, and that's for a number of reasons. And one of your points is that reason, but it's also to make sure we're not sourcing from countries where, you know, there is slavery or inappropriate working conditions or what have you. So I actually think that journey has already started, and the ESG is broader than just are they not carbon neutral. It is it's a much broader conversation than that. So that is well in train. I don't think my view is it isn't being pushed offshore, but I have 4 companies I'm involved with, and that's those businesses certainly are very strong on that. I can't speak for the entire industry.
Michael, do you have a view on that?
I mean, that's the role of the government as well that needs to come in. And back in around 10 years ago, for those who were around with the emissions trading scheme, there was a program called the Emissions Intensive Trade Exposed program, which is to stop carbon leakage, essentially. That's one of the big terms that you hear more and more. And also by default, other jurisdictions are now starting to impose border adjustment tariffs. So in Australia, if we don't have a price, you'll be slammed through your supply chain. I'm actually starting to hear commentary now through some of our clients that, hey, in 2027 or 2028, the EU's going to have a price and we're going to be outcompeted by our fellow competitors in Brazil, Canada and so forth. So it's really starting to bite now. But as Sally mentioned, it's not just carbon. There's water, there's ESG, there's modern slavery, there's a whole raft of things. So how do we as an industry tell that story through traceability? Once again, how do we chemically trace products, use technology, and how do we physically trace it through the supply chain to tell that story?
Before I move on to that slide, I just want to thank the panel profusely. That was really interesting. I think we sort of aired quite a few topics that are on people's minds there, and I hope you all enjoyed that. So please join me in thanking the panel. And just to wrap up very quickly before we let you run off to the first session of the conference, we do awards every year for the WA Index High Growth Awards. We gave our winners their trophies yesterday at our booth, but I just wanted to acknowledge them today. These are the 2021 winners of the High Growth Awards. So the way we do this is it's WA resource companies that have delivered the highest market capitalisation growth in the last year to 30 June. So please join me in congratulating the top 3 movers in the top 20, which is Piedmont Lithium Limited, Liontown Resources Limited, and again, Chalice Mining Limited, second year in a row. And then the top 3 movers in the WA Index Top 100, so generally smaller companies, VentureX Resources Limited, Vulcan Energy Limited, and Eagle Mountain Mining Limited. So congratulations to all of our winners. And our WA Index anniversary, 20th anniversary edition is available either on the website or at the back there, as well as that climate report that I referred to earlier. And please come and visit us at the Deloitte booth. We also have an interactive question to ask you there with some great giveaways as well. And that really wraps it up. So on behalf of Deloitte and the Gold Industry Group, thank you very much for giving up your very early morning to join us for breakfast, and enjoy your day. Thank you.